So Derek asked me to maybe set the debate a little bit in the Irish context and maybe just talk about some of the choices that might exist for policymakers around, the potential establishment of a mayoral office for Dublin, what kind of geographical mandate, what kind of spatial mandate the mayor might have, and what might be some of the choices in that respect. The functions that have been alluded to both by Colin and A as well, drawing on international experience. And maybe what some of the more political considerations, and again some of that has been touched on as well, in terms of some of the potential issues around firstly making a decision on this particular suggested initiative around our local government system, and maybe even potential obstacles that might exist as well. So I suppose just in terms of maybe, I want to just maybe very briefly set the context in terms of what I characterise, I suppose, as an on-off debate here in Ireland over, broadly speaking, the last 2 decades or more. This issue has come up, resuscitated, goes away again for a few years, and then comes up again. So we've kind of gone hot and cold on the exercise, never actually gone as far as putting it into place, but maybe sort of tracing some of the features of some of the proposals in the domestic context that have been made. Very briefly to talk about different executive models that might exist, to say spatial scale, geographical mandate of a mayoral office, some of the responsibilities that the mayor might have, and then I suppose looking at the different stakeholders and potential decision makers around this issue. So without doing a big long history lesson, we can, in terms of more recent history anyway, trace, I suppose, some of the more recent proposals around a Dublin mayor to the reorganisation of the local government structures in Dublin. So the splitting up of the old Dublin County Council into 3. There were suggestions made by some political parties at that time that maybe we needed a mayoral office to serve for more than one term to provide a Dublin-wide perspective. So if we were going to go down the road of having 4 local authorities in the county of Dublin, so to speak, the city and the 3 new county councils as it was back then, maybe we needed a sort of a Dublin-wide perspective, a mayoral office to give a Dublin-wide perspective. The 2001 Act has been mentioned as well, the provisions within that dealing with a directly elected mayor for every county and city in the country, for 34 as it was then. So Dublin City plus the 3 other Dublin county areas, county councils, Fingal, Dun-Laoghaire, Down and South Dublin, were going to get a directly elected mayor under that legislation. No additional powers, nothing was specified at least in the law. Minister at the time made a lot around, a higher visibility for the office, greater legitimacy coming through direct election, but no actual additional powers provided for. One interesting feature, I suppose, of the 2001 provisions was term limits. No individual could serve more than 2 consecutive terms as mayor, that is 10 years in total. So that was, I suppose, an interesting feature, some debate about that at national level recently. So we know those provisions repealed in 2008. I might talk a little bit about potential reasons why. The Green Paper in 2008 proposing a single directly elected mayor for the 4 Dublin local authorities. That actually manifesting itself through a bill presented before the Oireachtas in 2010, which set out largely, I suppose, strategic powers, whereby the mayor would adopt a Dublin-wide strategic framework in areas like land use planning, housing, transport, waste and water, but that operational responsibility for the delivery of those services would remain with the 4 local authorities working within that strategic framework. That bill never passed into law. The Dáil fell in 2011, wasn't resuscitated then by the subsequent government. Instead we had putting people first. I suppose the tone of that document, pretty apathetic, non-enthusiastic perhaps about the idea of a Dublin mayor, but did, as I mentioned, put in place this 2-step or arguably 3-step process, that this forum or colloquium of councillors from the 4 local authorities would have to put together a set of proposals. They would have to adopt a resolution within the 4 to approve those proposals. That would then go to a plebiscite, and then it would go back to the minister to legislate. And the forum then came up with a set of proposals suggesting a much stronger executive role for a directly elected mayor, again for the 4 Dublin local authorities, in housing planning, waste, transport, community policing, traffic policing, fire service, economic development, tourism, and then a strategic role, again, sort of setting a strategic framework in areas like healthcare, education and water. So I suppose envisaging, a much stronger role for a Dublin mayor in terms of that set of proposals. I might come back to, I suppose, where some of those, where some of the resistance, I suppose, to some of those proposals came from. But I suppose just in terms of executive models, and again, some of this has been touched on already, just to suggest, I suppose, to the audience, directly elected mayors, notwithstanding their increased popularity in many parts of the world, across Europe, places like South America as well, they're not the only show in town in terms of debates around changing our executive model. Just to take one issue with what something Colin said, I've mentioned there, de facto, we've got de facto directly elected mayors in places like France and Spain. And as you say, you're correct in the sense that in Spain, the council still chooses the mayor, but the nature of the party list electoral system is, that voters know that if I'm voting for party A, for example, I'm effectively voting for that candidate's top listed individual as their candidate for mayor of the area. So if that party wins enough seats on the council, well, then that individual is going to be mayor of the council. So I suppose it's a sort of a blended, sort of a legally not directly elected, but I suppose voters, are conscious of the top listed candidates on party lists because of the electoral system there. I suppose another option would that's been used in fact many of the local authorities in England that don't have directly elected mayors, and also in countries like variants of it exist as well in the Netherlands and Denmark as well, a cabinet system. So much like we do at national level here in Ireland, we elect 158 members of the Dáil, and the Dáil then in turn, or a majority within the Dáil, then elect 15 people to run the country who sit in cabinet. And a similar system can operate, I suppose, at local level, where you have in effect executive councillors, a small subset, executive powers being vested in not one individual but a subset of the council. So effectively you've got executive councillors. In some countries they call them aldermen, so we could resuscitate that title, dormant since 2004 local elections here in Ireland. And you've got backbench councillors. So it's another model that's been used. And as A mentioned, the council manager system increasing in popularity in the US. We hear a lot about the very, very big cities in the United States, because especially about directly elected mayors, because the very big cities like New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and the like, they tend to use the directly elected mayor model. But actually most cities in America now use the council manager model, not that unlike what we have here. So where staffing responsibilities are devolved to a manager, to a city manager, where city manager is responsible for providing services within a budgetary framework established by the council. In some cases in New Zealand and in many US local authorities, that coexists with directly elected mayors. But I suppose the distinction is that the manager is responsible to the council as a collective body rather than to the individual mayor. So there is a sort of a blend at work there, where you do have that council manager system coexisting with directly elected mayors. Just then, in terms of the geographical mandate and some of the options that are available around, the spatial size of a mayoral office, I suppose in a sort of ascending order, you have sort of the Dublin City Council area. That was what was envisaged under the 2001 Act. Given the week that's in it, what might popularly be called the GAA Dublin, the True Blue Dublin, so to speak, which might, I suppose, be the most natural way in which people might think about the mandate of a Dublin mayor for many citizens. And again, I suppose that was the area that was envisaged under the Green Paper in 2008 and indeed the 2013 proposals from the Forum. We could look at a planner's exercise, so look at commuting patterns, look at a threshold above which, a certain proportion of people in areas commute into Dublin City on a daily basis, and maybe delineate a new boundary on the basis, particularly maybe if the mayor's mandate was going to be focused on areas around land use planning or transport, it might make sense to delineate a new metropolitan Dublin boundary on the basis of things like commuting patterns. Administratively inconvenient, but possible to do. Or we could go for the greater Dublin area, that is Dublin City and County plus Meath, all of Meath, all of Wicklow, all of Kildare. Or we could go for the new Eastern and Middle region, a wider region. So I mean, people will have, I suppose, instinctive views about what may or may not be feasible, I suppose, in terms of geographical mandate. And I suppose in terms of responsibilities, I mean, broadly speaking, we could distinguish between some kind of balance between strategic and executive responsibilities. Is it primarily about setting a framework within which either existing local authorities or national agencies have to operate, state bodies have to operate, or is it about transferring personnel, transferring decision-making powers, transferring budgets to a mayoral office, giving them more executive powers? I suppose the 2008 Green Paper tended to lean towards the strategic role. The 2013 proposal much stronger on the executive side of things. Potential areas again have been mentioned in previous proposals listed there. And what might be the mix of transfer of responsibility from the existing suite of services provided by the local government system and things that might be transferred by national agencies. I suppose there you would have to say, I mean, our experience around devolution in Ireland is pretty limited. So our precedent in terms of transferring responsibility from national agencies or departments to local government is pretty limited. And certainly a reading of the likes of the 2010 bill or the Putting People First programme as well would lead one to think that if we were going to establish a mayoral office, the bulk of responsibility would probably come from the existing suite of local government services. The 2013 proposals went much further in terms of transferring responsibilities from a series of national agencies and bodies, and so I understand that led to quite a lot of resistance, particularly at cabinet level. A lot of ministers apparently at the time were not thrilled with the idea of personnel and budgets being transferred from their responsibility to a new mayoral office. So I suppose that just leads me to sort of a final point around, some of the stakeholders. If we were looking at establishing a mayor with an electoral mandate, say of Dublin, the GAA Dublin, a population of about 1.35 million as of this year's census, that would have that the individual holding office would have a considerable electoral mandate. To what extent would that be something welcomed by national government? And indeed, to what extent would that be welcomed by cabinet? We have, I think, by common consensus, an executive-dominated system at national level. We don't do checks and balances really in Ireland. The 15 people that sit around that meet every week to run the country and serve as ministers. We have a relatively weak legislature by international standards, a relatively weak parliament, we have a relatively weak head of state, and we have a relatively weak local government system. I'm open to correction, but I can't think of that many examples where a government has consciously made a decision to set up a political office that would maybe act as a counterbalance or a rival or a more questioning source of contention, I suppose, to the dominance of cabinet. We have of course had ministers who've been interested in spreading the power a bit, but I think they've tended to be in the minority. Once they get to the ministerial office, they tend to be less than enthused about spreading the power around. Backbench TDs. As I understand it, the 2003 amendment to repeal the provisions in the 2001 Act on directly elected mayors in each county and city was, effectively torpedoed by backbench TDs and senators who were less than enthusiastic about the idea of a mayor serving office for 5 years in their backyard, potentially from their own political party, and this serving as a platform then for the next competition at general election time. So another group of stakeholders, I suppose, that potentially exist around decision making on this issue. Local councillors, Colin has talked about that in the UK context. I detect a little bit of a change. Some surveys of councillors which suggest the idea is a little bit more attractive, but I think councillors are less than united, and we might get a reflection of that in the discussion afterwards. Less than united on this kind of issue. You know, some in favour, some less enthusiastic about it. And then again, Colin has mentioned in the UK context, if we got to the stage of a referendum, you know, there's no guarantee that, you know, citizens are actually going to approve. As we know from our own experience with referenda here in the Irish context, they can be very unpredictable things. So opinion polls might show strong support for a proposal early on in a referendum campaign, but that can wither away relatively quickly as we get closer to polling day. So, you know, there are, I suppose, a number of stakeholder groups that we might need to think about, I suppose, as part of the decision making around this office. So that's just a very quick summary from my point of view around some of the potential choices, and look forward to the discussion afterwards. Thanks very much.